Here we've got another different look for the gun. This one, as I mentioned before, is a little bit beat up. And I think weathering is a really nice touch to make your images just feel a little more believable. So I'm going to skip past the first stage because really there's nothing different than what I just showed on the caution version. To roll it back a bit, I started by changing the color of the background, then I changed the color of the gun, all using gradient maps, curves, adjustment layers. Again, made easy because I could pull up these selections. Now I just need to add the weathering, and that's what we're going to focus on here. In the previous series, if you watched the one about overlays, you might expect that weathering would just be add photos on top and maybe use some neat blending mode to just use some selective colors. Well, I'm actually going to do a different approach. What I want to do is to paint this sort of weathering, but to sort of paint it by hand, at least to paint it with the brush tool, so that I have complete control over which colors I'm using. But the way we're going to get there uses a selection. In fact, I'd say it's reliant on edge control. And it starts with an image like this one from cgtextures.com. This, we'll call it, is the shape. I want weathering to have the general look of these sort of dirty drips. So there was, some dirt first and then it rained, and the end result are these drip marks. What I don't want are the colors from this. So really, I'm just going to think of this as the starting point towards making a neat selection. Well, as you know, selections are black and white. So I'm going to even just take this photo here and start by making it black and white. What I want are the drips themselves, not the negative space. And as you remember, we want visible to be white and hidden to be black. So I'm going to say image adjustments invert. And now I'm just going to use some adjustment layers to kind of get this into the zone I'm looking for. And here's where understanding how to do masking is really helpful, because I don't want to do a single adjustment layer uniformly to this entire thing. I want to take certain areas and modify them separately. If the photo was more uniform to begin with, I wouldn't have to do this step. But here I'm just trying to kind of make it a uniform amount of white stripes with black negative space. It's not perfect, but I think it'll work for us. Now the final thing I want to do is to get the perspective out of it. So I'll make a flat copy, paste that in place, and now I'm just going to use the warp tool to kind of pull this camera distortion out of there and try and make these stripes more purely vertical. These sorts of steps are definitely going to be things we talk more about in the next series. So I'll be trying to be brief here. Okay, so I'm going to do a flat copy, bring it back into my document, and paste it in place. And what these are going to be are the starting point for creating a selection, but I need to make them match the perspective of my image. So here I'm going to convert this into a smart object. This, if you've been following along, is a process you've seen before. And the more I look at it, I don't really want the top and bottom part of this so much. So I'm actually going to undo that, and I'm just going to crop that down a bit. That's more of the look I'm going for. Like that. Okay. So as you know from the previous series, here's where I'm going to do a layer group to combine all these together. And I'm going to turn this into a smart object. And I'm going to start matching the perspective of the image. I'm going to make it a little bit lower transparency just so I can see what I'm doing better. And I'm just going to start thinking about what's the shape of my gun and kind of where would the weathering be? What would it look like? And it might seem like this would be a place to kind of go a little faster. This might seem like a big detour, but believe me, being a little slow and methodical in this phase is going to make the next phase look really good. Now, if I want to make it wrap around the grip a little bit, I could do a warp and kind of bulge it out. That might look nice. I'm rushing a little bit. Were I doing this for my own work, I'd probably be a little more careful at this phase. But you can just keep making these following the perspective of the gun. And then I'll do the same on this other one over here. There's a lot more foreshortening here. So you're gonna see a kind of a tighter cluster of those stripes. And I'm speeding up the footage here because, well, really there's just a lot of repetition in this process. But as you can see, getting good with the warp tool and the free transform tool for the right perspective is very important for this phase. Okay, so I have made a bunch of these areas of drips. Oops, forgot one. Sometimes it's nice to look at full opacity just to make sure you're doing the right thing. Now I need to clean it up a little bit. The only area I really want it is within the gun itself. So I can make an area with a negative space. Got that selection already, so I can just fill that with black. And now you might be able to guess where this is all headed. I'm not going to use it as an overlay layer. What I am going to use it as is a selection. And you remember from before when we were working with alpha channels, white pixels are visible and black pixels are hidden. Well, we need to do kind of one intermediate step here, which is to copy all this information, black and white pixels, go into the channels, make a new channel, and then paste. Now, why I have to do this intermediate step, I'm not really sure. Photoshop just doesn't have an easy way to convert a black and white image straight into a selection. But once it's a channel, what I can do is I can control click on my new channel, and it's going to select all those white pixels and leave the black ones as hidden. So I'll go back to my layers here, hide this whole group that I've made temporarily. So you can see here, I just have a complicated selection that's where all those white drips were. Before I do anything else, I'm going to make this a selection layer, because that's what this is all working towards. So within my selection layers, this one I'm going to do is like a kind of a light tan, and I'll fill that in and get rid of the selection. Whew, that was a lot of steps, but what it's left us with is a selection layer that I'm going to remember to name, call it drips, that all I need to do is control click on that layer and I get this very complicated selection. And sure, you could have achieved a similar result using just a photographic overlay, but what this gives us now is a really complex stencil. Let's see what we can do with it. So we'll select drips, hide our selection layer, and now we are going to make a new folder back in our actual painting, and I'm just going to call it weathering. And I'm going to put this as a mask for the entire folder. So now I don't need to have those marching ants visible on screen anymore. All this led up to me now being able to paint with opaque paint, and it's only going to be visible where those stripes are. So let's hide the ones from the example. We've got a fresh gun here. It's gray, but it doesn't have any weathering on it. And so now I'm just going to paint with any color. I'll use a visible one first. And you can see it only goes in those stripes. This is great. I don't want orange. Orange is ugly. But what I do want is to think about what slightly contrasting color is going to look nice. On top of this shiny metal, I think what I want is dark. So for here, I'm going to paint with maybe one of these dark blues. And I can paint that in. And I can be really heavy-handed if I want, and it would be a strong effect. But mainly, I want to be subtle. So I'm going to kind of paint and erase carefully. But I'll know that anything I paint is already in this dirt stencil. So here on the plastic, maybe what I want is a little bit lighter and a little bit browner. You know, like there's actually some mud on there. So I've made a new layer. I'll select the color I'm starting from. I'm going to shift it to brown and just raise the value ever so slightly. And I can paint with a textural brush if I want to. Doesn't really matter. Look at that. I can be as particular as I want, only really putting it where it's going to look good. I don't need to think about it like a photo where I'm kind of tied to whatever colors happen to be in the photo. I can paint with whatever is going to make this image look nice. So maybe here I could go a little darker actually. Go to that brown hue and then drop the value down. So here I can have the mud be even darker still. I could paint with a soft airbrush And then maybe in the shadow, I actually want it to be a little bit lighter than the shadow so we get a little more contrast. So under here, I kind of do a reverse effect. And a lot of this is really about subtlety, so you can kind of go back and forth and remove it where it's too much. Maybe add some where you don't have enough. But the whole time, even though I'm just painting with flat colors, I get this great drip effect, all because of this mask that I made. It took me a few steps to get to the place where this was all in the right perspective and it was all the right amount of contrast. But once it's set up, now I just paint. This is that whole idea of being creative, in fact, being more creative by just spending a little time ahead of time and planning and kind of setting up a neat effect, something that Photoshop can take away the monotonous work of staying inside the lines and allow you to think about artistic choices, creative choices. And in this way, it's a pretty different way of thinking about art making than the lessons you learn with traditional media. If you watched my direct painting videos in the Color Starter Kit, this is 100% different from what I was talking about there. But I think there's something special about knowing you can work this way. I think you won't always work this way. It's sort of a situational thing, but knowing that it's possible, I think kind of changes the way you can approach paintings. And if you bought the bundle, we're going to continue talking about how to really control the photo manipulation process. Because as we briefly saw at the end here, starting with a photo of drips really was only effective because I knew how to modify it to meet my needs. And there's a lot to talk about with that. But hopefully this has been an eye-opening experience to see just how much control selections and masks can add to your painting. I think it's so easy to skip over this stuff and think it's not important, but it really is going to set you apart from amateur painters. So practice this stuff, learn those keyboard shortcuts, and make masks second nature. Thanks so much for supporting the series, guys. It makes a big deal to me, and I really appreciate it. See you in the next video.